And welcome back. Last week, we did a lesson that I called Uncle Sam's Unpayable Debt, in which I argued that the U.S. government's debt has grown so big and its future obligations are so open-ended that that its total financial obligations cannot be repaid in money of today's purchasing power. Now, when you think about it, the problem is not exactly that there is too much debt. More precisely, the problem is there's too much debt relative to our ability to pay for it. So, you can imagine in your personal life, if you have an annual salary of, say, $100,000, but you owe $200,000 and you have annual interest of 10%, well, your annual interest costs then are $20,000, 10% of 200, but that's 20% of your income. And that's a huge burden on a salary that size. And it's really so big, you probably couldn't service that debt under normal circumstances. And that's why no one would lend you the money in the first place, unless you had, substantial collateral. But if you could figure out how to earn a lot more money, say you could get a new job that pays you $500,000 a year, the interest burden on your debt then falls to a trivial percentage of your income. So, with that amount of income, $100,000 of debt wouldn't be too much of a problem, wouldn't be a problem at all. So problem solved, right? Now, that kind of rapidly improving financial condition is possible for an individual, although it is rare, but it's literally impossible for an entire sovereign nation to do that. Advanced economies grow in real terms at less than 5% a year, and usually much less than that. But but modern economies can easily grow in nominal terms when their banks create money faster than the real output of the economy. In other words, inflation is likely going to be the politicians' answer to their debt problem. Now, this debt problem is becoming urgent, so our politicians are going to need to act pretty soon. But so our question today is, what actions are governments and monetary authorities going to take as they attempt to alleviate this debt burden? What will central banks do? What will the financial regulators do? What will the legislatures and what will the commercial banks be required to do? What are their real options? Okay, let me share screen now. Let's have a hard, there it is. That is why, that's the one I want to share. That's why I titled this lesson, The Disease and the Cure. The answer, I think, is likely to be kind of a paradox. Money creation in the hands of the government was and is a major cause of our sovereign debt problems. And I think, ironically, money creation is also going to be the government's proposed solution to this problem. And that's why I named this lesson as it is. So today, let's delve in a little detail into the options that the government has to address this debt problem. And I'd like to divide, the discussion into basically three parts. First, I want to do a review, a brief summary of why inflation or, excessive money creation causes governments to accumulate so much unpayable debt. I want to be sure we understand this point in concrete terms. All right. So I'm going to take a few minutes to do that first. And then second, we're going to look at what the government's four cash flow options, what levers they have, that they can use to improve their cash flow problem. And then the last part, the fun part, we're going to ask, what will this financial repression, as we call it, what will their options look like in practice? Okay, so let's dive into part one. How does inflation enable politicians to accumulate unpayable sovereign debt? So to kick off this discussion, let me ask you a few questions. Okay, and I think this will be pretty obvious, but it'll get us thinking. Let's suppose that government taxes one group and gives money to another group. They just, collect taxes and pay it out to, I don't know, the homeless or cronies or whatever. Is that an act of inflation? Is that an inflationary act? Anybody? If you rob Peter to pay Paul, but don't create new money, is that inflationary?
No.
No. Yeah. So, right. So, bad as that is, as potentially destructive as that is, it's not inflation. Okay, now similarly, if the government borrows money from one group, say from investors who want and savers, and they give this borrowed money to another group, like the unemployed, is that inflationary?
No.
No, it just simply shifts spending from those who loan the government money to those who receive the money that was collected. So if the government could not create new money or influence the banks to create new money, but could only borrow from the investment community's available pool of savings, would there be any limits on how much they could borrow? Or I should say, what would be the limits? Because obviously I'm implying there is. As they borrowed and borrowed, wouldn't people eventually run out of savings to lend? Yeah. And as they ran out of savings to lend, wouldn't they want a higher and higher interest rate to compensate them for diverting their spending to other things? So obviously there's limits on government spending in a non-inflationary world. I think that's obvious. So if the government, through any action that it does, causes new money to be created and spent, we have established, I think, that that's inflationary. All right, now recall from lesson 3 that when money is created by the banks, and the banks are regulated by a free market profit motive, that this is generally productive money creation. In other words, the new money is backed by a productive income stream that pays the loan off over time. And then in lesson 4, when we talked about bad money creation, we showed that bank lending directed by the government is indeed inflationary. And we had a couple of examples of that. We had the Japan asset bubble of the 1980s, where the Japanese banks were required by this thing called window guidance to make real estate loans based on asset values and not on the project's ability to pay the interest and principal back. And the resulting asset inflation caused a major banking crisis that lingered and damaged Japan for many years. And then the other example we used was during the recent pandemic from 2020 to 2022, the US government borrowed heavily from investors in the bond market and then sent this money to citizens and businesses. Simultaneously, the Fed was purchasing an equal amount of bonds from investors, sort of reloading their bank accounts with new money. The result was that, the Treasury then had money to spend on the unemployed, and the bond investors got new money to restock their Treasury portfolios to buy other investments. I mean, that was highly inflationary. And just by review, I mean, here's how much money the Fed created during this pandemic QE. From January 2020 till April 2022, the Fed caused $4.8 trillion in new money. That's the orange arrow there, to be created in the commercial banks. increasing the broad money supply, M2, by almost 30%. Now, the total money supply increase during this period was 6.1 trillion. So 4.8 trillion was about 80% of that created solely by the Fed's bond purchases. And
Jim,
this is my,
um,
yes.
I was just going to ask, your own book had said more than once that even worse than taxation was government spending. And I really don't understand that. Do you agree with that? And if so, is this what that means? Is that how spending is worse than taxation?
Uh, well, I'm not sure I understand the difference between taxation and spending. Taxation, all government taxation, all goes to government spending. If you mean that, or if he means that the continued spending, which has to be financed by inflation, is worse than straight. In other words, if he means that financing government by borrowing and then financing that borrowing by inflation is worse than straight taxation, yes, for sure. Taxation is at least more honest because it's visible. You're able to calculate it. You know, the government takes 20% of your money and you see it in your pay stub, you see it in your tax return. When they siphon it off by inflation, you don't see it.
I
So yeah,
see. Thank you. That's very helpful. It's something that really confused me.
yeah. So
Yeah,
I
I
think,
think I think part of Yaron's point is that you can't solve the problem, the fundamental problem, by reducing taxes because yeah, they just find other ways to finance it, and yeah, inflation is certainly one big one. So I think that's why he says the focus should be on the spending, because until you get the scope of government and the spending under control, you won't really be able to solve the taxation problems long term.
yes,
Yeah, I
indeed.
really had not appreciated that. I thought what he was talking about was, one, that you're picking winners, and those winners are not what the market would pick. And two, even if it was winners the market would pick, you've got the bureaucratic middlemen, essentially amounting to, burning part of that cash in a
Well,
dumpster fire.
yeah, the picking winners and replacing capitalist choice as the in government, replacing capitalism as picking the winners, that is a big problem. And I think but I agree, even worse, that's a big problem. But even worse is the surreptitious theft of, I'm sorry, I can't say it any other way, of wealth through inflation. You don't really see it, unless you understand it. And on that point, let us now, I'm issuing a little challenge here. I want to do a little reprise here of how inflation encourages and enables government sovereign debt. Now, keep in mind that politicians, politicians think of solving the debt problem as an annual recurring cash flow problem because they're incentivized to think short term, just till the next election. They tax and borrow as much as possible to fund their expanding promises. And to them, the only constraint is how much they can raise net on their near-term cash flow. And as we said, if they were limited only to taxation and borrowing without creating new money, the appetite for lending to the government, the demand for bonds on the part of the public would be limited by the public's investment funds and by interest rates. But now, enter government monetary authorities, usually central banks, which force their commercial banks to monetize the government debt, which means the debt, when I say monetize, it means the debt is taken out of the market and replaced by new money. Now, let's see now how central banks cause their member banks to monetize government debt. Now, we've looked at this before, talked about this a couple times. Motivation alert. If you understand this, you are well on your way to becoming one of John Maynard Keynes' 1 in a million who understands how inflation can wreck the economy. Okay, so here we go. First, let's go through this transaction to understand the mechanics, and then we're going to review the economic implications. There's three parties to this transaction. There's the private investor. He's the owner of a bond. There's the investor's commercial bank, which has the authority, the legal authority to create deposits. And then there's a central bank, which has the legal authority to create cash or cash reserves, also technically called standard money. So to monetize this treasury bond that this investor owns here, this treasury bond, the central bank first offers to purchase this bond from the private investor. The private investor is not a bank, but he does have a bank account. Now, the investor agrees to sell, probably because he's going to make a slight profit on this transaction. To pay the investor for the bond, the central bank creates new cash reserves out of thin air and gives them to the commercial bank. Simultaneously, the central bank directs the commercial bank to credit the seller with new bank deposits. This is the point at which the new money is created, and it's highlighted here in red. Okay, so now the result, all the accounts balance. The central bank now has a bond that it didn't own before, a new asset in the bond, and a new liability in terms of cash that it owes the commercial banks. Now, this is how the central bank's assets grow. And an important note here, when the central bank buys a bond, it still gets interest from the treasury because it owns the bond, but it then returns that interest right back to the treasury in the form of a dividend. And that neutralizes the bond. It takes it out of the almost the cash flow calculation in terms of the government, because it costs the government nothing. They pay out interest and get it right back. So that's all right. Second.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Jim. Question on this. So I'm trying to understand what's different happening here versus the same thing that we had discussed in the lecture 2, and you had a transaction there where the bank had actually bought a bond from the private investor, right? So like the commercial bank had bought the bond from the private investor, and then basically it had then gone to the central bank and said, here's my new asset, and just change my bond asset to cash reserves, right? So,
Yes.
So what's different happening here?
Very good observation, Pooja. Exactly the same thing happens. So if the commercial bank buys this bond, it creates new money. But then it would have the treasury bond on its as an asset and new money as a liability. When the central bank then buys the bond from the commercial bank, it just pays in new cash reserves. All QE does was combine those two transactions, and importantly, does it in huge size over a very long period of time. So yes, it's two transactions, but the way the Fed does QE, they engineer it so it's all occurs simultaneously.
So then then how is there a growth in cash reserves if you do it this way but not in the other way?
Because the other way, if the commercial bank had simply done the transaction with the investor, what would have changed here is you would have had a treasury bond as the new asset and deposits as the new liability. and the Fed would not have been involved in that transaction. But then when the Fed purchases the bond from the commercial bank, it moves over here and they pay for it with cash reserves this way. The only thing happening here, and it's not different, the central banks have been doing this in small size forever. What's different is the Fed now, starting in 2009, the Fed started doing this transaction in big size and forcing the commercial banks to be part of it.
So just to clarify, if the central bank is out of it and the commercial bank just buys the treasury bond directly, that's no different than you and I buy your treasury bond off you for $1,000. It's just a change of private hands in effect, right?
No, it's not, because the bank pays for it with new money. If I buy a treasury bond from you, all we do is swap ownership of bank accounts in treasury. We just swap assets. Your asset, a bank account, is swapped with me for my asset, the treasury bond, and no new money is created between private non-bank investors. Is that clear?
Oh, so the transaction with the bank necessarily brings in the central bank because of the management of the cash reserves?
That doesn't have to. The individual bank can buy treasuries.
I guess that's what I was getting at. You could have a simple transaction with the bank where the bank is holding those bonds as investments,
Right.
rather than applying them to their reserves.
That's right. And without increasing bank reserves. And in fact, banks are able to monetize a certain amount of debt, government debt, this way. And lots of governments like Argentina use their banking system, not the central bank, but their actual commercial banks, to monetize a lot of their debt. And as we're going to see, I think that could be in the cards for our commercial banking system. All right. I hope that's this transaction is clear. Obviously this will be included in the manuscript, and if you want to look at it and stare at it for a while and go over it, sometimes I forget. It's taken me years to automatize this, and I shouldn't expect you to do that because you have other things to do, right? But I think if you can see what's happening here, it goes a long way to understanding how government can manipulate money creation.
Okay, just one more small clarification. So you have the 1,000 deposits marked in red, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's to convey that it's new money. So how is that different than when the commercial bank has transacted with the bond owner and created a deposit for the bond owner? Why is it in red here and not in the other?
Well, I'm not sure why I didn't put it. I put it in red here because I wanted to emphasize what the Fed is doing here, how they're engineering this money creation. But I probably should have put it in red when I showed you a transaction just between a commercial bank and a private investor. But yes, it's new money. But
in that other case, it's not new money, right?
Whenever a commercial bank purchases an asset, it creates new money. Whether that asset, remember that from lesson 2. Whenever a commercial bank purchases an asset, they create new money to do so. Whether they're buying a bond or whether they're buying your promissory note, which is really making a loan to you.
Okay.
All this is doing, by injecting the Fed here, what this is doing is it's monetizing debt and taking the debt out of the market, essentially. Okay, so the market implications of that is that the increased demand for bonds caused by the Fed's action here drives up bond prices. Now, again, we're talking about engaging in this activity in large size over a long period of time. So now, I hope you see that. Now, imagine if the Fed was purchasing cars this way and just storing them in the parking lot of the Eccles building, in New York City. What would happen to the price of cars? The price of cars would go way up, and the price of bonds goes up too. But what happens when bond prices rise? Interest rates fall. Does everyone understand why that is? Because let's say you're an investor, you own a long-term bond issued at a price of 100, and that pays $5 per year in interest. So it's a 5% bond when you buy it. And the Fed comes along and buys the bond, and the demand drives up the price by 10% to a price of 110. Now, this bond, it's not a new bond, this bond that they bid up now yields about 4.5%, $5 divided by 110. And that means that new bonds issued at a price of 100 are going to pay this competitive lower annual interest to yield 4.5, not 5. And over time, persistent purchases of bonds by this unconstrained buyer, the Fed, central bank, any central bank, is going to put downward pressure on interest rates. Right now, the investor has new money, and he's now going to reinvest his new money, possibly in a new treasury bond, possibly in some other asset with a yield higher than the new market yield. The Cantillon effect works on investments too. You get new money and you're going to spend it in a specific direction. But the overall effect on the market is to push bond prices higher and interest rates lower, while demand for investments rise due to the increasing amount of money that investors have to deploy. And so this procedure is called monetizing the debt, because the central bank takes the debt instrument, this bond, out of the pool of bonds available for public investors. That's up here now. If they hold it, it's no longer available to investors. And they replace this bond, the bank and the Fed do, with new spendable money. That's monetizing the debt. Now, here's the point for this little review. Continually monetizing this debt along with falling interest rates makes it much easier for governments to expand their borrowing. First, because the bonds available to investors are temporarily in limited supply, due to the fact that the Fed bought so many. Second, because falling interest rates mean bond prices are continually rising, and that encourages investors to buy them in the market and sell them to the Fed. This is sometimes called front running the Fed, and this became a big source of profits for bond investors. Buy a bond at a yield of 4, the Fed bids the price up and buys it at a yield of 3.5, gives you money back. Buy a new bond at 3.5, Fed bids the price up, you sell it at a yield of 3, rinse and repeat. This can go on a long time, and it did. And if it goes on long enough, politicians think it's a permanent condition. And this kind of unique situation of falling interest rates created by money, caused by this monetizing debt money creation, leads to the belief among politicians that increasing the deficits doesn't matter, because it gets cheaper and cheaper to finance them. So, the result is that politicians operating on their short-term political time horizon continue to make more new promises and borrow more and more to pay for those promises, because they don't feel financially constrained. And these promises include annual increases that they make. These promises they make include annual increases in entitlement spending that are built right into the law that governs the budgets. And therefore, future spending has to rise, requiring even more borrowing. And so eventually, as we've seen in the last few lessons, rising interest costs due to both the increasing quantity of debt and the rising interest rates once you overwhelm the market and interest rates start to rise again, you get into this problem of overwhelming the government's ability to borrow, which is where we are at now. And once you go down this path, you know with certainty that the government's not going to be able to fulfill its financial obligations without addressing its cash flow problem. And that's where we are today. And so if there's no further questions on this review, I hope I didn't take too much time for that. No, we're good. I'd like to discuss now, if we got any questions or comments, let's do them now, but I'd like to discuss what are the government's cash flow levers? What can it do to improve its cash flow situation? So we got any questions or issues? I'm glad we got those questions in. I hope it was helpful. All right. Let's then move on to the second part of second question of the day, really, which was what are the government's 4 options to improve its cash flow problem? And I would just say that because politicians are incentivized short term, they're much more concerned with year to year, and I'm talking about most of them, much more concerned with year to year cash flow than long term funding considerations. In other words, their problem is to find money this year and for the next election. And because these funding problems generally arise gradually, the politicians tackle the symptoms as they arise, and they make incremental adjustments to their cash flow year by year. So they're basically kicking the can down the road, like I'm showing in this little cartoon here, tackling not the big problem, but little problems. Now they have 4 near-term options, or financial levers, as I call them, to improve their short-term cash flow, enough to allow them to kick the can down the road, extend their tax and borrow and spend cycle year by year. They can, reduce or limit their promised payments. They can increase tax revenue. They can find more buyers for treasuries, and they can hold down interest costs. So you can see where these are. Reducing or limiting promised payments is controlling the outflow. Increasing the tax revenue is improving the inflow. Finding more buyers for treasuries is improving the inflow. Holding down interest costs is controlling the outflow. That's all they can do. Okay. Now, last time we ruled out, I think, severe austerity, in other words, suddenly living within your means, only spending up to tax revenue, or wholesale default, or hyperinflation, because those kinds of outcomes are unacceptable to voters, and they can probably be avoided by the politicians, at least for the near term. So I think the most likely near-term option, which I called last time, smoke and mirrors, what that will consist of is tweaking the cash flow problem with sort of artful deception on all 4 of these fronts. And these tweaks will include, I think, a combination of soft defaults, selectively breaking promises, efforts to increase the tax revenue, attempts to expand or maintain access to borrowing in the treasury market, and an effort to suppress interest costs by artificially capping interest rates. Okay. So with that as overview, let's go now to what I call part 3, which is, what is this what is this financial repression? What is this effort to solve our cash flow problem going to look like? Well, now I want to ask you a question. Do you think there's any reasonable possibility that we will get a genuine change in the public's perception and the voters' perception of their entitlements and the responsibility of public spending? In other words, is it possible that we are going to see anytime soon a constructive change in the public's understanding of this debt problem that would allow a rational solution, which to me would be some kind of honest default, an admission that the government we just can't afford this, and we're just going to have to cut back the promises.
Fat chance.
Fat chance. Okay, so like slim and none, and slim just left town, or whatever my dad used to say. But I think it's unlikely. But I just want to point out that there was a time only about 30 years ago when the USA did experience what I'd call a small wave of fiscal sanity. It was in the 1980s, and we had a real fiscal crisis, and debt to GDP was modest, but interest rates were so high, they were as high as 20% in 1980, that interest costs on government debt was causing huge deficits, up to like 35% of tax revenues. And these deficits looked very terrible and threatening then, and they attracted a lot of political attention, and many politicians and economists were very alarmed. And the political upshot of that widespread concern with the debt was this guy, Ross Perot. Maybe Mark's heard of him. The rest of you may not have. He was a Texas entrepreneur who self-financed an independent third party and ran for president. And based primarily on the concerns about the rising deficit, Perot actually got almost 19% of the popular vote in the 1992 presidential election. He split the Republican Party, and the result was that a Democrat, Bill Clinton, got elected. So, and just to illustrate how important the voters and politicians of the time thought that this federal debt issue was, President Clinton then cooperated with a majority Republican Congress, and they balanced the federal budget to create a modest surplus for several years. And here it is in red. See, I think it was year 2000. They actually had a $21 billion surplus, collected more than they paid. That's amazing. Now, actually, this was achieved by a combination of factors. There was this realization that there's a limit to spending, and it was a cultural change, and it was expressed by Bill Clinton, who said he wanted to end welfare as we know it. There were also a couple of other good things. Declining interest rates helped, and strong GDP growth, and taxes as high as they could get. Tax receipts to GDP were right up to the 20% limit, what I have called a limit. I think it's kind of a limit. So it was a combination of these factors that allowed the surplus. But so all credit to Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress for that kind of rare bipartisan realization. But as you can see by this chart, the surplus didn't last long. The deficits resumed in the early 2000s, and they began this increasing trend that you see. In the early 2000s, right after the dot-com crash, stock crash, deficits returned to stay. And then, of course, you had the war on terror, and which was very expensive. In 2003, Republican Vice President Dick Cheney remarked famously, he said, "Reagan taught us deficits don't matter. In other words, blame that guy, Reagan, for the deficits we have today. He said it was okay. So actually, there was some plausible justification for this sentiment on the part of everybody, including Dick Cheney, because deficit at the time, which is, remember, deficit is just spending more than you collect in taxes and borrowing the balance, borrowing what you can't collect in taxes. That was not yet a big problem. And it would not become a problem for several years. From 2000 to 2010, the total debt rose and the deficits continued. But, even by 2010, debt was only 60% of GDP. And you had falling interest rates, which masked the detrimental effects of the growing budget deficit. So today, I think several of you already agreed, the public mood is much different. Future promises are much greater than they were. The deficit problems are much worse than they were. So while it's possible, I think it's unlikely we're going to see a genuine social or cultural change that puts responsible legislators in power. Not anytime soon. That kind of a change would mean fewer government promises, reduced spending, more self-reliance on the public's part. I just don't see that happening. I don't see anyone willing to, forego on their goodies. No one's going to say, "Oh, I won't take my Social Security," or "Oh, I'll opt out." I don't think that's going to happen. Not enough people anyway. So anyway, line one, the option to reduce or limit promised payments, is that open as a real possibility to politicians? Are they going to get that? Well, maybe at the margin, because some non-essential voters can be paid less than they were promised. For example, the very wealthy are going to take a hit. They probably won't get their Social Security eventually, or they'll get way less. They'll pay more for Medicare. They'll pay more for their own disability. But that's not going to be enough to change an election. And those people are not powerful enough to affect an election. So you can take away some of their benefits. I think you can bank on important voting blocks like unions and minority groups. They're going to get their promises. They're going to get their payments. For example, minimum wages are going to be raised as usual, because those votes are important to the politicians. But what happens in these situations is the prosperous middle class bears the brunt, because that's where the money is. Remember what whoever the thief was, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. I forget who said that. But so the promises to this group are going to be underpaid, but they're going to be disguised by some sleight of hand, is my theory. So, for example, an example of this, the government can understate CPI inflation to control the cost of living escalators that go to Social Security and disability. They're already doing this. I may have mentioned in another lesson, according to Grant's Interest Rate Observer, over the last 50 years, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which calculates the CPI, has changed its CPI calculations 25 times. And guess how many times that recalculation has resulted in a higher CPI number? 0. 25 out of 25 adjustments have worked in the government's favor, meaning lowers the cost of these escalators that go with the entitlements. And I think they will continue to underestimate or understate these cost of living adjustments to entitlements. And this is a form of soft default that I'm talking about. Just to explain this chart here, this is the blue line. The red line shows the annual change in consumer price index as it is under the current calculation rules. The blue line shows how today's price changes would be calculated under the 1990 rules. So what it's telling you is peak inflation as measured by the CPI was about 9% in 2022, now having fallen to somewhere just south of 4%. If it was calculated like it used to be, it would have been about 17%, having fallen now to still in the double digits. Now that is quite a difference. And that is, there's a lot of tricks that can be played here to make it appear that the government is abiding by its obligations, but the real cost of living escalators are declining. So, I mean, if you're the government, you want inflation in the form of rising prices, which also means a rising nominal GDP, but you don't want the optics of high inflation. So you simply change the way the inflation is measured to make things look better than they are. Okay. All right. So bottom line here is on this, line 1, I think promises are going to be paid for the most part, but they'll be reduced selectively only when the government can kind of get away with it and still stay in power. In other words, I think the bottom line is reneging on promises is not going to be a big source of improved cash flow for the government in the near term. It's a small source. All right. How about option 2? Increasing tax revenue. How can the government increase tax revenue? Now, my premise is, and I'm not sure it's right, but the tax revenue as a percent of GDP is not likely maxed out at roughly 20% of GDP, maybe a little higher, but we went over the Laffer curve last time. Due to that relationship, I think we're probably maxed out at that percentage of GDP. In addition, you have something called bracket creep, which raises your tax rate during inflation. Does everyone know what I mean by that? In other words, we have a progressive tax schedule so that the higher your income goes, the greater the percentage you pay of that incremental income. So on your first $100,000 of income, maybe you pay 20%, but then the government says anything above 100,000 you earn, you pay, let's just say 50%. Well, as your income rises due to inflation and your standard of living stays the same, but now your nominal income goes to 200,000, now you're going to pay 50% on that whole increment above $100,000. So your real tax rate will go up. Now, a lot of that will go on. It's been going on for years, and that's called bracket creep. But, there's other taxes that can be raised at the margin on selected groups. And those are the ones, as I've said, whose votes count the least. So you might be able to raise capital gains taxes on the wealthy. You might close tax loopholes like things that are called 1031 exchanges that are very favorable to avoid capital gains taxes on real estate. You might have selective taxes on, so-called sinful activities like, booze, marijuana, recreational drugs, gambling. That's all going to be fair game for more taxes, I believe. And you probably see something that, if they can get away with it, carbon emissions taxes, higher gasoline taxes. Carbon emissions taxes have been proposed, and I think they'll be tried if certain political elements are in control. But the big point about this is all these kind of taxes will only be marginally effective in raising the total tax, because if they risk killing GDP, they might risk lowering the tax revenue because of the Laffer curve effect. Now, one possibility is the government might, I think you'd have to do it with popular consent, but they might implement a value-added tax, which is basically a national sales tax. Ron DeSantis has proposed this to simplify the tax structure. From the government's point of view, that might be advantageous because you could start very small and then experiment by raising it to see where you are maxing out your tax revenue. The Japanese government does this, but this could also backfire because if you raise the tax too high, you could suppress GDP. So these are all possibilities, these taxes, new taxes. But I think the main avenue has to be for the government to attempt to inflate the total spending on GDP-related activities, consumer mostly, or final consumer and investment activities, therefore increasing the national income and therefore increasing the tax base and therefore raising the tax revenue. And I think this could be done for a prolonged period. It worked to alleviate the war debts in the UK, France, and the USA after World War II, where we were able to pay off large debts through inflated taxes and suppressed interest rates. And the government, I think, under this condition, might require or at least encourage the banks to lend to GDP creating activities. And one way to do this would be to require the Fed, which is the bank's main regulator, and its other regulators, the Treasury and the OCC and so forth, to control the direction of money creation. And I just saw an example of this in the paper the other day, and here you go. This is an example of lending or money creation directed by government. And in this article, the Fed is now telling the banks to consider the effects of climate change on your lending, which, so therefore you see, this is the kind of thing that that the government can use to direct banks to lend to these, what I call these GDP producing activities. And if you want to see these categories, you can look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's a government website, and they have all the GDP categories. But they would be things like directing money toward durable and non-durable goods sales, domestic investment, export industries, the big categories that affect GDP in a big way. You could initiate a soft Soviet-style industrial policy, which required banks to invest to reshore key industries like certain tech industries or strategic microchip industries. You could favor domestic defense contractors so that you're putting that spending back on shore and inflating it. You could have infrastructure investments. Now, we already saw some of this by the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, but not much of that went to actual infrastructure building, where money went to contractors and so forth. But you could really beef that up and just have banks create money to build infrastructure. Japan did that in the 90s, big time. You could charter government-sponsored industrial banks, like the third world countries have done. They literally set up industrial banks that are allowed to lend only to specific, quote, development industries. And then there's something that Mark and I were talking about just before this. We started recording this session. Local governments are now trying to charter their own banks. And Mark just wrote a pretty interesting article about that he shared with me. And Mark, do you want to comment on that? I mean, this is a way for local governments to create money and direct it to their favorite projects.
Yeah, and I think all these kind of things start small and, may even seem somewhat innocuous, but they have a sneaky way of growing. And like, I'll just put this in the chat. This is something I saw. Actually, this is a city not too far from your California place, Jim. City of Murrieta, California, took some of the federal money for the pandemic and used it as kind of a backing for an offer of these gift cards where they did this match because they wanted to encourage people to get out and shop locally after all the businesses were hurt during the pandemic, hurt by the state's policies, shutdown policies. And so they would basically match, you buy $100 gift card for a downtown business, and then the city's going to match you. And so now you have $200 to spend. And so this was ostensibly backed by the federal money. But what happens if they decide, the federal money's run out, we still like this program, it's popular, we're just going to match and then fund it out of our general fund? And so, you get this kind of scope creep of in these schemes that before you know it, now the city's running a deficit because it underestimated how popular this program was going to be if they didn't cap it. So, I mean, I'll just say a couple things. You've got different levels of local government disrupting the economy, and I think with the public banks potentially creating money or a kind of a version of fiat. When they issue debt, say to build a building or for infrastructure, they're crowding out private lending. They're disrupting the market, and that has its own kind of issues. When they defer maintenance or pension funding, they're adding debt burden and they're shifting burden to future generations. So in a way, you could call that a transfer of kind of intergenerational transfer of wealth. But with the banks, the more they take this seriously and really operate like the banking system that you're describing, they're going to be able to make promises that are kind of off-book promises that effectively increase the supply of money in the area. And then if these muni banks wind up being federally guaranteed, they can indirectly create money because the Fed will likely fund any bailouts with fiat money. So I think you get a bit of a chain reaction. But nobody really understands this, right? None of this is really discussed. It's all, well, the banks are ripping people off and we're going to come in and they have this fantasy, we're going to take that profit that the banks are making and we're going to reinvest it in the community. I mean, and there's a real movement and an active movement in the United States to create public banks. And basically that means you're going to crowd out the services of the highly regulated private banks, and you're going to turn all this banking into just a local political circus. And San Francisco is on the forefront here, but not far behind is Oakland and Seattle and Philadelphia.
And are we surprised it's starting that the camel's getting his nose under the tent in California? Are we surprised? No, we're not. But that was a great little synopsis, and I think you described exactly what is likely to happen, or at least the direction that this is too good. Money creation is too good an option for government to give up. So, yeah, I mean, this is all right. So, just in the interest of time, so I agree with you, Mark. Let's expect governments. Let's expect banks to be created and run by local governments. And you might see things, I would expect a bank in San Francisco to subsidize green energy. And you also might have, banks making sweetheart loans to, labor intensive industries. As long as we create jobs. Don't forget, we still have a lot of room in this country for housing market stimulus. So government could ask, banks to lower mortgage rates. They could manipulate that. The Fed could manipulate that by starting to buy mortgage-backed bonds again. You could have legislation that made old mortgages assumable, which would lower, make a mortgage transferable from one owner to the next. And you could subsidize basically lower income homeowners, which has been going on a long time. But the main effect of all these kinds of manipulations of the banks will be to increase spending activity at the aggregate level, but not necessarily real production. In other words, you'll be inflating GDP. Now, I want to stress, I don't think this kind of policy, industrial policies, selective lending and so forth, will completely eliminate true investment and true growth, real growth. But I think it will probably seriously further impinge on free market efficiency. And I just want to stress a point that Mark just made. Why is this government directed or government influenced lending so appealing to governments that need money? Well, it's a great way to disguise spending. They don't have to tax anybody. Let the banks create the money and let them spend it on what the government that founded the bank wants. So the government doesn't have to borrow in the treasury market or the local municipal bond market. No impact on the budget. Nothing shows up on the budget line. In addition, if you know banking, it doesn't take a lot of money to guarantee an unproductive loan. If you guarantee just 10% of an unproductive loan with tax money, you can create 10 times that money, 10 times that injection of capital that came from the taxpayers, and still lose money on a loan, and you're good because you're backed up with enough capital to make it pay to the bank. In addition, there's ways that we haven't even talked about. This kind of gets esoteric, but if you change banking laws, banks can actually recapitalize themselves. If a bank lends, say the bank lends the money to me, creates money to me, and I agree that I'll take that money and I'll invest into the stock of the bank. All I've done is recycled that money that they created back into bank capital, giving them a pad, to absorb losses. Now, Richard Werner pointed that this was done at Credit Suisse, and it was done by a number of Italian banks during the financial crisis. Bank regulators mostly don't like it, but it could change. Okay. The bottom line on this option is, I believe you're going to see a growing nominal GDP manipulated by various means coming from the banks that will allow tax revenue to be raised. Okay. All right. So I'm going to run out of time if I'm not careful. So let's go on here. How about finding new buyers for treasuries? All right. This is a big deal because foreign lenders to the U.S. government are kind of drying up, and what I show on these very snaky looking graphs are here on the left side. The red line is the declining ownership of Chinese treasury bonds. They've been declining since 2014. The blue line shows that Japanese holdings of treasury bonds fluctuate, but they have not changed much in the last 10 years. Even as our funding needs in the USA rise, the Japanese are holding steady and not increasing as our funding needs increase. This is a a similar chart. But what I want to point on the right, what I point out here is who's taking up the slack of funding the growing U.S. government debt needs as foreigners decline. That's the blue line that sails into the stratosphere there. That's the Fed. That's the Fed's bond purchases. So, you know, that can only go on so long. So the Fed now totally dominates the Treasury market. And but of course they've caused a lot of problems through QE as they do this. So the US government is trying to find new lenders, new bond buyers, and they have been successful. The obvious long-term option for the Treasury is more QE. You know, let the Fed buy those bonds. But as I said, that is at least temporarily on hold. So various bank regulators, Fed, Treasury, Comptroller, could encourage or require commercial banks to buy more treasuries. And the banks have already increased their government holdings by over $4 trillion in the last 9 years, since 2014. And that was due to some relaxed rules on in bank accounting. And they could be relaxed more. And I want to point out that banks do create money and monetize government debt when they buy treasury bonds from a private investor. And that is how the Argentine government has funded itself for many years. You could relax other accounting rules in the banks to encourage them to buy more treasuries. We have these things called mark-to-market rules for the treasuries held by the banks. In other words, they have to state for some of the treasuries they own, those that are available for sale, they have to mark the value of those on the balance sheet up and down as the market price changes. But you could relax that rule. You could even mandate that the banks own more treasuries. You could say, well, if you want to be a bank, 25% of your assets have to be in treasuries. You could ease the capital requirements. You could make what are called risk weightings that are imposed on the banks. You could make those contingent on the banks owning more treasuries. I know this all sounds like mumbo jumbo, but I'm just telling you the stuff that comes to my mind as I think about what the government could do. Now, we've already seen the government attempt to, for example, the SEC expanded the market for treasuries in 2015 when it changed the rules for money market funds. And they've now made it unattractive for the managers of money market funds to buy anything but short-term treasuries. There's over $5 trillion in treasuries today held in money market funds and other sort of government debt instruments. Pensions are a good target. For example, in 2017, there was some legislation that gave pensions an incentive over the short term to buy long-term treasuries. And of course, there's now direct borrowing from the public. So those of you who are US citizens, are you now aware that you can go to a website called treasurydirect.gov? Maybe even the UK guys can. I don't know if you have to be a citizen of the US. You can go directly and buy directly from the Treasury at auction. And that makes it very easy to own and save via treasuries. Interestingly, Japan's national debt, which is very high and a bigger percentage of GDP than ours, much bigger, is mostly held by private household savers. They have invested for years through the Japanese postal system, and they have saved for years despite very low interest rates. So now Japan seems to be a nation of savers much more than the USA. So it's not clear to me that a government-sponsored savings plan would make a big dent in financing the government here, but it's being tried. and I promise you it will be expanded. However, keep in mind that the interest you get on these savings are always going to be less than the rate of the loss of your purchasing power or the rate of the CPI increase, because that's how financial repression works. Other things that could happen, the Treasury could make savings, a mandatory benefit option for all employers. So, for example, they might say, oh yeah, you can deduct X amount of your paycheck to go into a savings plan, but it has to go directly to the Treasury. Or you could, make ownership of treasuries mandatory for some businesses. Or you could put more tax incentives on treasuries. Let me ask you, if you have a 401k plan and the government says, oh yeah, you can have this 401k plan, but you're not going to be tax deferred or tax exempt unless 25% of your plan goes into treasuries. How many people would understand that or squawk about it? Practically nobody. They say, oh yeah, I've got this plan. I got to put 25% of it into treasuries. Okay, great. I get 3%. So there's all kinds of ways to require individuals and financial institutions to require them to purchase treasuries.
Or they could require states or municipalities to hold a certain percentage of treasuries, because that would just blanket the country. When you think of all the special districts and cities and counties across the country with their idle funds, yeah.
Absolutely. And of course,
quick question, how are
they don't
treasuries?
pay tax on that return. Go ahead. Yes, Pooja.
Yeah, how are treasuries different from just a bond that a commercial bank might sell? Is there
You mean like you say commercial bank? You mean like a corporation might sell? So
no, like
if
CDs and bonds? Are bonds and treasuries the same thing, or they're different?
Treasuries are a type of bond. They're a type of bond that is backed by the U.S. government. It works very similar to, say, a bond issued by Apple Computer, which is backed by the revenues of iPhone sales.
Okay, so the commercial banks don't sell bonds?
They do, but it's part of their capital structure. Most of their so-called funding comes from money creation. Yeah, they do. Okay. They do sell bonds.
Okay, thank you.
So, sorry, Jim. Well, once the government has created a domestic demand for bonds, what's the likelihood it might impose a tiny bit haircut on the residents?
Sorry, I didn't give me an example of that. So, in other words,
for example, once you have enough small investors that have bought bonds, could a government force them to take a haircut for defaulting a small amount just for the domestic market?
Oh, I see. In other words, say, okay, you've given us $10,000 investment. Sorry, your investment's only worth $8,000.
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah.
Well, I believe that would be met with almost with pitchforks and torches. That would be seen as such an obvious lack of good faith on the part of government that I don't think any legislator would put up for that. That's why I think these slow inflationary policies are much more likely, because it's like death by 1,000 cuts, or the proverbial frog in the boiling water. Nobody notices. That's really the key. Okay, so now the last lever that the government can pull is to hold down interest costs, and very simply, they'll do this with something. One of the ways they'll do it is something called yield curve control, YCC. And this is what the government of Japan has been doing for many years. The government of Japan just buys all the 10-year bonds that the Bank of Japan, I should say, buys all the 10-year bonds that the government issues. And thereby they suppress the interest rate. For a long time, it was at 25 basis points, 0.25%. Then they raised it to 50 basis points. They just the other day raised it to 100 basis points. But in Japan, the cost of living is much higher. The CPI inflation is now near 4%. So in Japan, the cost of living is obviously rising much faster than Mrs. Watanabe's ability to grow her savings nest egg. And that is real financial repression. That's the pattern that I see coming here. And like I say, this is called yield curve control. I suspect the Fed's going to try it in some form or another. They probably won't call it that. But in general, you can control yields but you can put direct caps on certain kinds of interest rates by law. Like, for example, you asked Marco or Richard, whichever one of you asked, could you just take a haircut on the bonds? More likely, you'd impose an interest rate haircut on the savers, but you'd say your principal's there, but we're not going to give you that enough, the old interest rate. You get a new lower interest rate. Now, suppressed interest rates like this most impact, again, the prosperous middle class, the conventional savers, the bedrock suppliers of capital in an economy who now cannot earn above the rate of inflation. And, how are they going to react to suppressed interest rates? Well, remember my story about my friend John last time. They're going to work harder, they're going to work longer, pay more taxes, work extra jobs, and experience this bracket creep of higher taxes. And the low real interest rates are going to prevent them from replacing their lost purchasing power with savings. In other words, accumulating real savings to keep up with inflation has been and will be a problem. So just since we're running out of time, just a quick summary here. I think to summarize this as concretely as I can, just got to get the following connections. Nominal income will grow due to money creation in the banks, and that'll be influenced by government. Government revenue will grow, tax revenue, due to the inflating tax base. And you can expect moderate to high CPI inflation as this goes on, which is necessary to keep expanding nominal GDP. The government's going to hold down interest costs below the rate of CPI inflation, I believe, or at least they'll try. And therefore, the government's cost to service their debt is going to grow much slower than its tax revenue. And the government will thus reduce its interest to income ratio. Remember what we called the insolvency ratio. And this will allow it to continue borrowing in the treasury market. So just as a way of, I came up with a little parable, which I have to share with you and see what you think of it. Imagine you have a small dairy farm, okay? You're a farmer, you have a small dairy farm, and you store, you milk your cows and you store your milk awaiting a sale in a very large refrigerated tank, and people come by and they purchase it by volume. They come and go and they purchase it from you. But unknown to you, a government official decides to tax you and pay himself and give milk away to his cronies. So he comes to your farm at night and siphons off milk to use for himself or to give away to his cronies. And he replaces the milk that he takes with water. So this milk is now diluted, but it looks the same. But it's nearly impossible to detect the theft by just looking at it. And so you, the farmer, you continue selling your watered down milk, but you're unaware of the diminished value of the product. The milk looks the same, but eventually your customers begin to complain. The diluted milk doesn't taste as good as it used to. Products like butter and cheese made with your milk are not as good as they used to be. And your customers' children are even losing weight because the diluted milk is less nutritious. But you're working just as hard. Your cows and your hired farm hands are working just as hard. But the value you generate by your work is literally being siphoned away. And unless you discover the theft, you won't understand what's happening to your livelihood. And this is what happens under financial repression. It's inflation that's hard to detect and for which there's no clear remedy for the individual person. Okay, now real quick, in closing, I want to recommend a person. Financial repression is underway, and this guy, Russell Napier, who's an Edinburgh-based monetary economist, he's one of the sharpest analysts on this rising phenomenon of financial repression. He's a brilliant scholar of financial history. He's written several good books on financial history. He's got a fortnightly newsletter. It's expensive. It's £1,500 a year, but it is worth it if you ever want to delve deeply into the subject. So I think non-professionals might find this publication a little expensive, but you can be on the lookout for Russell Napier and his occasional public interviews for insight. I know that I find him to be very valuable. Finally, on the manuscript, you'll see a recommendation of an interview by an economist named Luke Groman. This is a very good podcast that's free and starts at about 50 minutes, and his portion lasts like 20 minutes. So see if I made my time with 6 minutes to spare. How about closing comments? Brilliant contributions. Any questions?
I have a question.
Sorry to cut you off, Jim. I think we need to wrap up because we need a little bit of time before the daily objective.
Okay, I'm going to take it out of your hide next time, Daniel.
Oh my God.
I mean, Megan, you can at least ask the question, and maybe Jim can prepare better next week for it. Or
No, that's really fair. Thank you, Daniel. I was going to ask, I got the impression that all of these politicians who are willing to do this were really Jim Taggarts, which is such a damning thing to say. But it seems like, they clearly can't fix the problem themselves, and they're not willing to let anyone else fix it by, for example, privatizing Medicare. You know what I mean? They just want to break it more. Is that fair? Am I being on, am I not being even-handed about that?
Megan, we could probably it might be fun to have a long discussion about that. In my opinion, you are trying to understand the face of evil and how, and your questions are grappling with the nature of evil. Is it just ignorance? Is it good intentions? Is it evasion? Is it inflicting deliberate harm? What is actually going on here? I believe the answer is a spectrum of motivations and a spectrum of ignorance. And so there's very little pure innocence here. That's the best I'll do. And you can bring it up. Next time will be a good time to bring it up too, because we'll talk about real investment possibilities, and it'll be a good time to bring that up. So with that, I'm going to give Daniel back his time.